Everyone, Betsy Green. Good evening, everyone. The Flying A years were a golden time for Santa Barbara. The studio was here more than a decade, from 1912 to 1921, and made hundreds of silent movies here on the streets and out in the country. The movies are interesting, but I thought that the activities behind the scenes were even more fun. That's why the subtitle of the book is Highlights, Hijinks, and Hazards. I only have time to cover a few of the items from the book. It has 194 pages and more than 300 images. I got the idea for the book cover from a cartoon in a vintage movie magazine. Then I grabbed some markers and added some color. I had so much fun that I decided to add dozens of old movie cartoons to the book that you can just enjoy or use pencils, crayons, or markers to create your own masterpieces. Misunderstandings. A lot of the misunderstandings happened because the movie folks would just show up in a location and start filming, often without telling people what was going on. Their attitude seemed to be, no permits, no problem. So, here's a cartoon about a sheriff noticing what seems to be a lynching about to happen. The caption reads, "The sheriff of Muskrat County spies a lynching party, but..." It turns out to be only a scene for a photoplay, meaning a movie. So when he shows up, he realizes that, oh, it was just those movie folks again. They thought it was a big joke, that their movie making looked so real that it fooled the local gendarmes. Sometimes the cameraman included surprised onlookers in their filming. Here's one of the first movie misunderstandings that happened in Santa Barbara. Before the Flying A arrived here in 1912, there was another movie studio here in 1910 called the S&A, and I'll tell you more about them later. One day, they just started filming a comedy on State Street in front of a tavern. The movie scene involved a man fainting outside a saloon and then being given a drink to recover. However, some local tavern owners thought that the film company was making an anti-liquor documentary. So, one of the saloon owners stole a piece of the motion picture camera. Finally, the mayor and the chief of police stepped in and prevented the conflict from escalating into open warfare. And the film company promised to avoid making movies in front of the saloon. Anyone recognize this location? Right, Casa de la Guerra. Well, this is a smart crowd here. I expect nothing less of you folks. One of the reasons why the Flying A located here was to take advantage of our historic architecture. While the studio was filming some scenes for this 1913 film called The Ghost of the Hacienda, a journalist who was new in the city got excited when he heard a woman at the mansion saying, "They have shot out all the windows, and now they are smashing in our door." The newspaper man thought he had found a front-page story until he noticed a cameraman filming the scene and learned that the items being destroyed were props that belonged to the film company. What about this location? All right. the mission, sorry. I was testing you, right? Yeah, okay. Sometimes the actors in costume were taken as the real thing. This sometimes happened to actors playing beggars or churchmen. A Hollywood studio was making the movie called The Crucifix of Destiny near the Santa Barbara Mission in 1920. An actor dressed as a monk was given a handful of change by an old woman who mistook him for the bona fide article. This is Mary Miles Minter, the studio's ingenue star. I guess she was tired of being recognized all around Santa Barbara, so sometimes she went around in a disguise like this. This actor is made up to play Don Quixote, here in a 1915 film by a Hollywood film company. Since they didn't have a studio here, he would put on his makeup and costume in his room at the Potter Hotel. He was riding on the elevator one day when a little old lady stepped inside. When she saw him, she screamed and fainted dead away. He called a doctor who gave her some smelling salts, and the actor paid for the doctor. Another time, when this actor was in costume and eating in a local restaurant, he was mistaken for an insane person who was missing. Stunts and hazards. In the silent movie days, actors and actresses did all kinds of stunts that were hazardous or downright deadly. This was especially true during the 19-teens, when the action serials were so popular. But it helps to remember that everyday life was more dangerous a century ago. For example, there were no seatbelts, and you did not need to take a driving test in order to get behind the wheel of a car. Things that we take for granted. The caption here reads, "Director, fine, hold it. All right, now you may climb up and chase the bull away." A lot of stunts at the Flying A involved cowboys. Some of the cowboy actors had been working as ranch hands until they switched to playing cowboys on the screen. This is Jack Richardson, the numero uno villain at the Flying A. He boasted that he had been killed on screen more times than anybody else. Not surprisingly, he was one of the actors who was most frequently injured. One accident occurred while the Flying A was filming a horse chase for a 1912 film called The Law of God. The posse was chasing the bad guys. The cowboy actor leading the posse fell down and was lucky that he didn't get trampled. His horse stumbled and fell, pinning the actor's leg underneath, and slid about 15 feet on the downgrade, dragging the actor with him. The other cowboys following had the presence of mind to ride around him. The actor had severe bruises on his face and head, but no bones were broken, and the horse was tended to by a veterinarian. All right, what's the location here? Right, Junipero Plaza. Okay. This served as the entrance to a prison in the Flying A film in 1913 called The Scapegoat. In the scene, a bunch of prisoners are escaping, and one actor accidentally fell from the gate and was badly banged up. The Flying A did have some stuntmen, and I imagine they were injured most often. The Flying A and other studios at that time didn't really have much of a budget for special effects, so they took advantage of natural events such as forest fires and floods. They would rush some actors out to the area, okay, then have them run around in the water or the flood, and then go back to the studio and figure out a story. In 1913, there was a fire in Hope Ranch, so the studio rushed out and had some actors and actresses do stuff in the fire area. The lead actor had one arm that was scorched, but there were no major injuries. The performers were not the only ones who flirted with danger. Here's a photo of a scene being filmed for the 1915 Flying A serial called The Diamond from the Sky. According to a movie magazine, this car was racing along at 60 miles per hour. However, what was usually done in the silent days was to do a scene slowly and later speed up the film so that it appeared to be 60 miles an hour. It's one of the advantages of not having sound. Kid stuff. There were several child actors at the Flying A. Most were children or relatives of the actors or actresses. Here's a cartoon. Little kids saying, "Say, mister, me and Freddie's just been fighting, but we'll do it over again if you'll get our pictures into movies." Like many adults, there were lots of kids who would love to be in the movies. And sometimes the kids got in trouble. When the S&A studio was filming here in 1910, a little girl entered a corral where there were 60 or 70 big steers. The little girl surprised the cattle, and they started to run around. Fortunately, one of the cowboy actors saw what was happening and jumped into the corral to rescue the little girl. She was okay, but he was severely bruised and almost unconscious. Now, anyone recognize this building? Yeah. It used to be, extra credit for this one, it used to be St. Vincent's Orphanage. It's on De La Vina, okay, south of Carrillo. Okay. The building is still here, only after the earthquake, it's now only 2 stories instead of 3. So take a look at it the next time you're in that area. Some of the children from the orphanage appeared in a 1915 Flying A movie called Beppo. When the movie was finished, the studio invited all the kids and nuns to come and watch the movie. Some of the nuns and many of the kids had never seen a movie before. In 1915, a large trunk washed up on the beach in Santa Barbara after a big storm. When the trunk was opened, an infant was found, snuggled in blankets. So they say. 2 Flying A actresses were walking along the beach at this time and witnessed the discovery. They told others at the studio, and the story was made into a movie called After the Storm. The baby in that movie might have been this little cutie. This child was the son of one of the Flying A actors. Now, anyone recognize this child actress? This is a tough one. Now, this is baby Peggy, who was one of the famous American child stars. In 1922, she was here making a movie called Carmen Jr. for a Hollywood studio. Animal antics. People, young and old, were not the only performers at the Flying A. Some had wings, claws, hoofs, or antennae. Dogs and horses were probably the most common non-humans to act in the silent movies here. Some were well-trained, and performed on cue. Others, not so much. The dog on the left was nicknamed Peter the Great. and performed in a number of Flying A productions. He's in a scene here at Laguna Blanca, where he didn't realize that lily pads are not the same as the ground. He jumped out of the boat and tried to walk on the leaves, but instead he sank into the water and climbed out looking very wet and unhappy. This is a Flying A actress with Woodrow the Burro. He was probably named for President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow seemed to have a habit of misbehaving. The studio was filming a scene where Woodrow was supposed to lead some kids into the Libero Theater. But instead, he caused a scene when he dug in his heels and refused to go inside. Here's another troublemaker, Caruso the monkey. The monkey was featured in the adventure serial called The Diamond from the Sky. But unfortunately, this was a monkey with attitude. The paper said he was not inclined to be friendly. In fact, a few fingers have been bitten in the attempt to educate him to the film game. Fortunately, the Flying A actor who would be performing with the monkey knew how to speak monkey or something. The actor started some sort of outlandish gibberish that the monkey seemed to understand, and they became great friends. But the monkey's attitude toward others did not change. Here's the Flying A's leading actor, Bill Russell, with one of his many pets. He told a movie magazine, "This turkey is the best pet I ever owned, and I can derive more pleasure from playing with it than I can with any of your pedigreed canines." Probably the most unusual pet belonged to Flying A actress Margarita Fisher. She had performed with it in a movie and decided to keep the 28-foot-long python as a pet, although she boarded the snake somewhere else. A movie magazine wrote, "She has so completely tamed her pet that she can tickle it under the chin, pat its ice-cold, slimy sides, or play tag with it." Horsing around. There were so many stories about horses that I had to put them in a separate chapter. Some of the first performers to arrive in Santa Barbara when the studio moved here in 1912 were the cowboys. The local paper wrote, "Cowboys make picturesque appearance, coming up State Street after hard grind of 250 miles. They were travel-stained and dusty, but rode their horses with true Western grace." And you can bet this made a big impression on our city. Lots of times it was hard to find pictures of actual stunts or accidents, but I was happy to find this one. This is a grandstand in a local park full of people, and a cowboy actor rides his horse along the grandstand as he is pursued by a posse of cowboy actors. I hope they informed the audience about this stunt in advance. And sometimes the animals were injured in the filming of movies. This is a scene from the 1921 movie Black Beauty, filmed in Los Olivos by a Hollywood studio. At one point, the horse ran into a barbed wire fence and was badly cut. Of course, the Flying A actresses were also riding horses. This is Lottie Pickford, who was the star of the 1915 action serial, The Diamond from the Sky. She was an experienced rider. A movie magazine described an injury that Lottie received. She had been riding, and after dismounting and stepping to the head of the horse, it rose on its hind legs, and while in that position, kicked Miss Pickford on the chest. The blow did not come with full force, and while the injury was somewhat painful, she made no complaint. This Flying A cowboy was actor Peter Morrison. He saved his cowboy actor brother, Carl, from a serious accident while filming on the Mesa, where Santa Barbara City College is today. The local paper wrote, "Carl's horse got more than frisky and worked its way to the edge of the field and then shot toward the cliff. Peter Morrison, who was also mounted, got over in time to avert any trouble that might have befallen his brother. The cliff is precipitous and of a height of 100 feet. Another cowboy actor who was injured seemed to be asking for trouble. He was at the beach when he heard that a couple of untamed broncs needed to be ridden. The cowboy bragged that he had a tickling sensation in his back, which he wished scratched. His ambition was satisfied, for he lasted just 3 jumps. Since then, he has been using a crutch to get to work. On the move. The Flying A studio was fortunate to be here at a time when both horse-drawn vehicles and motor-propelled vehicles traveled around our city. Trains were not new, but movies of moving trains were relatively new. This cartoon refers to a story, which may or may not be true, that sometimes when early movie audiences viewed a movie of a train arriving at a station, the audience screamed and jumped out of the way, thinking that the train was going to come off the screen and hit them. Shortly after the Flying A folks moved to Santa Barbara in 1912, they were able to use the old Lompoc stagecoach in their films. One of the first films that the studio created here was The Jack of Diamonds, and some of the scenes were filmed on this stagecoach. Of course, when actors and film crew needed to travel to a filming location, they used automobiles. Here's a fleet of the Flying A's studio cars. And those were cutting edge at the time, right? Right. Probably one of the most daring stunts that the Flying A did with the car was in this scene for the adventure serial, The Secret of the Submarine. A stuntman and some dummies sailed over a 33-foot wide canyon in Camarillo. The local paper described it. The jump through space was taken over a washed-in bridge. The car was absolutely undamaged despite the heavy shock as it hit the ground nose foremost, 47 feet from where it took the jump into the air. About 400 people were present to see this stunt. The ravine was about 25 feet deep. The cars of the 19-teens were very unreliable. Tire punctures were common, in part because the roads were not paved well or not paved at all. Engine problems were a fairly frequent occurrence. So, when this Flying A rider drove all the way from Santa Barbara to Oakland and back by herself, it made the news in a national movie magazine. Mabel Condon drove her Santa Barbara car to Oakland last Saturday afternoon and came back Monday. This plucky girl drove all alone too. Okay. Whoops, hitting things here. All right, okay. Okay, where are we? Okay, this plucky girl drove all the way alone too, and it is quite a drive, even for a man. I posted something about that on Facebook, and I got like 2,800 people going, no. Okay. Some of the Flying A actors and actresses had pretty amazing cars. This is Mary Miles Minter in her peacock blue Packard that her mom gave her for her 16th birthday. It must have really turned heads back when 99% of the cars were black. Everything else. There were lots of fun and funky stories that didn't fit into a specific category, so I called this chapter Everything Else, which is easier to spell than miscellaneous. People have sometimes asked me if any Flying A movies were filmed in Goleta. The answer is not many. Mainly because there were rural areas around Santa Barbara that were much closer. For example, the studio filmed some cowboy movies way out in the rural area around Hope Avenue and Ontario Road. However, this is a photo from a movie that was filmed in the Goleta Slough. The movie was called Blue Moon, which is supposed to take place in the Wabash Flats of Indiana. Okay, close, right? All right, recognize this building? Right, it's the Samarkand Hotel when it was first built. A couple of movies set in the Middle East were filmed here about the poet Omar Khayyam in the early 1920s by some Hollywood movie studios. The man on the left is the famed director Erich von Stroheim. He was here with 125 actors and crew in 1920. Some scenes for his movie Foolish Wives were filmed in the dining room of the Potter Hotel. Silent movies weren't really silent. When they were shown in theaters, there was almost always music playing. And when the movies were being filmed, music was often played to help actors get in the mood. Now, recognize this building? It's the art museum now, but it used to be the main post office. Good, right? The post office was used to represent a building in Monte Carlo in the Flying A production of Peanuts and Powder in 1916. Now, here's a toughie. Anyone recognize the building in the background? It's the Glendessery Mansion in Mission Canyon. This was another picturesque building that formed the backdrop for the 1915 Flying A film called She Walketh Alone. The studio buildings. The Flying A was located in a couple of places in Santa Barbara. In the summer of 1912, the studio first began filming at an abandoned ostrich farm on the southeast corner of State Street and East Lye. Supposedly, there were still a few ostriches left on the property, but they had to go. In 1913, plans were developed for a permanent location on Mission Street between Chapala and State Streets. The architect was James Corbley Poole, who also designed the Carrillo Rec Center. The building on the lower left still stands, and a portion of the building on the upper right with the tower is still here. The Mission Street facade was designed in the Mission Revival style. This was a popular style for some of the other studios in LA. And by the way, our train station and some of the homes on Crocker Row were also Mission Revival style. Indoor scenes were filmed in the first glass studio in order to take advantage of natural light. The glass was textured to soften the light and avoid glare or shadows. Inside the glass studio, the film company set up multiple sets so that several movies could be filmed there at the same time. It must have been a bit chaotic and noisy at times, but that's one of the things you could do with silent movies. Most of the studio buildings were torn down in 1943, and one person told me she remembered that when she was a kid, she and her friends went rollerblading or roller skating on the old concrete slabs where the buildings had been. Fortunately, this portion of the original studio still stands at the northwest corner of Mission and Chapala Streets. S&A, Santa Barbara's first movie studio. As I mentioned earlier, the Flying A settled here in 1912, but there had been another film studio here for 3 months in 1910, the S&A. S&A was the nickname for the Chicago-based movie studio named Spoor and Anderson, initials S and A. They made about 15 movies here, mostly westerns. Their leader was a gentleman on the left who is wearing a suit that looks like it belongs to somebody else. He was nicknamed Bronco Billy. S&A used the head of an Indian chief as their logo. Sometimes this logo could be seen in the background of an S&A film as a sort of copyright symbol. Initially, people didn't know how to copyright something as ephemeral as a moving image on a screen. This is a scene from This is a scene from a 5-minute S&A movie called A Ranchman's Wooing. A widower asks a widow to marry him, but only if she can get her 4 daughters married first. Here are the 4 boyfriends trying to marry the daughters. This is a scene from another 5-minute S&A movie called The Bad Man and the Preacher. The bad man and the preacher have a fist fight outside a church. A school in Goleta was used as the church entrance. Unfortunately, there were 4 schools in Goleta in 1910, so we were not able to figure out which one was used. This is from a 10-minute S&A movie called The Sheriff's Sacrifice. The unusual feature of this movie is the use of a kid's camera. Some kids are up on a cliff taking photos with a Brownie camera and accidentally take a shot of a crime scene. Cutting edge, right? Here's a scene from a 1910 S&A film titled The Tout's Remembrance. It's unusual because part of the movie was filmed in Texas when the film company was traveling around, but this particular scene in a store was filmed after the company was here in Santa Barbara. Family memories. This is one of my favorite parts of the book. I posted a query in a couple of places on social media to see if anyone in Santa Barbara had family stories or pictures about the Flying A days, and I was happy to hear from several folks. Steve Nagelman, is he here? No? Okay. Sent me some wonderful photos of his grandpa, who had worked in the automotive department of the studio, and chauffeured many of the actors and actresses who were involved in the filming. Someone else told me that his great uncle performed as a cowboy actor for the Flying A and got paid $1 extra for every time he fell off a horse. If you're hungry for more Flying A material, other than my book, the Santa Barbara Historical Museum here has a permanent exhibit about the studio and shows some of their movies. It's behind the screen here. So, the studio is gone, but we have plenty of photos and memories. Any questions? All right.
How many silent movie actors transitioned into talkies? Do you know?
Good question. How many silent movie actors transitioned into talkies? It was a good question. Part of the actors were in silent movies because they didn't have good voices to start with, or they just kind of did it on a whim. Others had stage experience, so the ones who had a stage background did better than others. Some of them had decent voices, but their voice did not match their character, so that was a problem as well. And others had really heavy accents, like Greta Garbo and those people. So what the percentage was is a good question. I would say maybe half, maybe, and I think a lot just gave up. It was very, very different. In the early days of sound, it was not very sophisticated, and they would plant a microphone on a table hidden by some plants and tell the actors, you have to talk to the plant, as you're talking. Don't move around, and don't turn your head. And so.
I heard they were stigmatized. They thought, oh, these talkies will never.
Well, it was a big expense because the moving picture theaters didn't have the theater for projecting sound, so they were reluctant to do it. It was a big expense, and then it was a huge expense for the studios because now they had to be careful with the sound. They couldn't do 4 or 5 movies in the same place. A lot of them they filmed at night, so they didn't have the traffic noise, and then the cameras made noise. So the poor cameramen they put in a soundproof booth, and they just sweated to death while they're making the movie. So it was a traumatic time. Yes, yes. Another question?
You mentioned a couple of movies being 5 minutes. Was that the norm for the silent movie?
Well, in the early days, yeah, movies were only a couple of minutes long. From about 1895 to about 1905, movies were fairly short, maybe just a couple of minutes, and they didn't really tell a story yet. It's kind of like what we do with our cell phone cameras. We take a picture of a friend walking by in the solstice parade or a kid blowing out candles on the birthday cake, and you show it to your friends, and that's it. And they would mix it in with vaudeville performances. Then after about 10 years, people got tired of watching a train coming into the station, and so then they started doing somewhat longer movies and telling a story, but generally stories that people already knew. All they had to do was say, this is a movie about Jack and the Beanstalk, and you know what's going to happen. And then by about the time the Flying A got here, movies were like 10, 15, 20 minutes long and getting longer as time went on. It was an interesting period of transition. But good question. Another question? Why did they leave Santa Barbara? Oh, I wish they were still here. A number of questions, and I talked to Dana Driscoll about this. In part, it was a problem of distribution. There were 3 main factors in movies. There was the producer, the studio, there was the distributor who sent it out to the theaters, and then there were the theaters who showed it, the exhibitors. And over time, it became apparent that it was efficient to have all 3 of these entities under one umbrella. So you had Fox making movies, Fox sending them out to Fox theaters. In fact, any old-timers here remember the Arlington Theater used to be called the Fox Theater. Okay? After a while, that got thrown out by the Supreme Court about monopolies or something like that. So, sorry, the question, why did they leave Santa Barbara? Yes, Santa Barbara, we were the only game in town. So if you were not working on a particular movie, and as the movies got longer, they did fewer of them, if you were not in that movie, you didn't have anywhere else to go. So if you were in LA and you were not working for Selig Polyscope, you could go over to Fox or whatever. It was just around the bend. We had scenery here, but we didn't have a lot of flat area to have a lot of studios. Come back, come back. Another question back there?
Do you know who their source of film was?
The source of film.
Who the Kodak guys was?
No, I don't really know where the film came from itself. Good question. Dana, do you know? Chicago. All right, yes. Yeah, and it's interesting, yeah, that both S&A and the Flying A came from Chicago. So.
American Film Studio was Chicago.
Yeah, that's right. And the Flying A was the American Film Studio. Yeah. So, sure.
Was Flying A the West Coast or the Western region's largest theater at one point, or were there bigger?
Well, early on, we were kind of neck and neck with Hollywood, but after a while, they shot ahead of us. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I do have. There are some of my books in the bookstore. I've already signed them, and there's some flyers on seats if you're looking for another group to have a program like this. Okay. Thank you.